The last time I saw my grandfather's handwriting, it was shaking. Not the way old men's hands shake when they've lived too long and held too much. This was different. This was a man trying to be precise while terrified. The ink pressed deep into the paper in some places, barely ghosting across it in others, like his hand couldn't decide between screaming and whispering. I found the envelope on my kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, leaning against the coffee maker like it had always been there. No stamp, no postmark, just my name, Elliot, written in that trembling cursive I'd known my whole life. My grandfather, Harold Mercer, had driven 40 minutes in the dark to slide it through my mail slot. He hadn't knocked, hadn't called, hadn't waited for me to wake up. That alone should have told me everything. Inside was a USGS topographic map, the kind he used to spread across his dining table when I was a kid, pinning the corners with coffee mugs and telling me stories about places he'd surveyed in the 60s. This one covered the southern Appalachian corridor parts of western Virginia, a thin finger of eastern Kentucky, the ridges and hollows that don't appear on any GPS. A single location had been circled in red marker, pressed so hard the paper nearly tore. Next to it, in handwriting steadier than the envelope, he'd written, "Go here. When it starts, go here. Don't wait. Don't pack what you think you need. Pack what keeps you moving." Beneath that, folded inside the map, was a single sheet of yellow legal paper. 2 paragraphs. The first explained, in language more clinical than I'd ever heard from him, that a hemorrhagic viral mutation had broken containment at a federal research installation he refused to name. He'd been consulting retired FEMA infrastructure, he said, though I'd always understood his career in vaguer terms. The pathogen was neuroinvasive, aerosol viable for only a short window, but the real vector was fluid contact. Bites, scratches, blood in open wounds. Incubation was between 6 and 19 hours. After that, the host was no longer the host. The second paragraph was shorter. It said, "I'm sorry I never told you what I really did. I'm sorry I can't come with you. Your grandmother needs me here, and I've made my arrangements. Take Nora if she'll go. Take the Coleman Road, not the interstate. Trust the circle on the map. I built it for exactly this." I read it 3 times, standing in my boxers in the kitchen, coffee dripping behind me, the Tuesday morning light cutting through the window like any other day. Then I called him. It rang once, twice, 6 times. Voicemail. I called again. Same. I called my mother, no answer. I called Nora. Nora Castellano picked up on the second ring, which meant she was already awake and already anxious about something, because Nora didn't answer calls before 7 unless her own nerves had gotten there first. She was my ex-girlfriend in the technical sense, my closest friend in every practical one. We'd dated for 2 years in our mid-20s, broken up without catastrophe, and settled into the kind of bond that confused everyone who met us. She lived 11 minutes away. She worked as a veterinary technician. She kept a go-bag in her closet because she'd grown up with a father who kept 3. "Elliot, have you seen the news?" I hadn't. I turned on the television while she talked. A local affiliate was running a banner about an unusual public health advisory in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina. Quarantine language. National Guard mobilization. The anchor's voice was controlled, but her hands weren't still. "My grandfather left me something," I said. "I need you to come over, now." She didn't ask why. That was Nora. She parsed tone faster than language. 20 minutes, she said, and hung up. I tried my grandfather one more time. This time, the line didn't ring at all. Nora arrived in 18 minutes, with her go-bag over one shoulder and her cat carrier in the other hand. The cat, a 12-pound orange tabby named Diesel, was silent. Nora set him on my kitchen table and looked at the map without being told. "What am I looking at?" I handed her the letter. She read it the way she read X-rays at the clinic, fast, then slow, then once more with her jaw set. When she looked up, her eyes had changed. Not panic, decision. "Your grandfather built something, apparently." "Where is this?" She traced the red circle with her fingernail. The location sat deep in a hollow between two ridgelines, accessible by what looked like a decommissioned fire road branching off a county route I'd never heard of. No town nearby, no named feature, just elevation lines bunched tight enough to suggest steep terrain and a small blue thread indicating a creek or spring. "About 6 hours if we take the route he marked, maybe 7 with stops." "Elliot." She folded the letter and set it on the counter with the care of someone handling evidence. "If this is what he says it is, 6 hours from now the roads won't be passable." She was right. And I knew it the way you know weather is turning before the first drop falls. The television was showing footage from a hospital in Durham. Security camera, grainy, wide angle. A patient in a gown moved down a corridor in a way that made my stomach clench, not walking, not running, but something between the two that looked fundamentally wrong, like a body remembering locomotion through a fever dream. 2 nurses backed away. One didn't back away fast enough. The feed cut to the anchor. "Authorities are urging calm," she said. And the words meant nothing because her producer was whispering something in her earpiece and her composure fractured for exactly 1 second. "We leave in 30 minutes, I said. "We leave in 15, Nora said. I grabbed what I could. Not what I wanted, what mattered. Water filter, first aid kit, the hunting knife my grandfather gave me when I turned 16. Batteries, a hand crank radio, canned food 8 cans, whatever my hands touched first, jacket, boots, the map. Nora repacked her own bag with efficiency that made me feel like a child fumbling with the blocks. She separated items into Ziploc bags by category. She rolled clothing into compression cylinders. She filled every water bottle in my apartment, including 2 Nal jeans I'd forgotten I owned. She did all of this in 12 minutes while intermittently checking her phone, where a group chat with her coworkers at the veterinary clinic was lighting up with messages I could hear buzzing from across the room. "Marcus is at the clinic," she said, not looking up. "Okay." "He's alone. The morning staff didn't show." Marcus Webb. I knew him, Nora's coworker, mid-30s, built like someone who'd played college football and then discovered craft beer. Kind, loud, dependable in the way that big men sometimes are when they've decided gentleness is more interesting than force. He'd set a broken splint on a greyhound at 2 in the morning once, because the owner couldn't afford the emergency vet. "Nora?" "I know." She zipped her bag. "It's on the way." It wasn't on the way. It was 14 minutes in the wrong direction. But Nora was already picking up Diesel's carrier, and I understood that this was not a negotiation. Marcus was hers, the way certain loyalties are not romantic, not familial, just immovable. We loaded my truck, a 2009 Tacoma with 200,000 miles and a camper shell I'd never removed, and pulled out of my apartment complex at 7:47 a.m. The streets were quiet in the way that early mornings are quiet in mid-sized southern cities, but there was a texture to it I didn't like. Too few joggers, no school buses. A neighbor I recognized was loading suitcases into his sedan with the hurried, graceless motions of someone who'd been awake all night. Nora navigated. I drove. The radio was playing an emergency broadcast on loop. the same measured language about localized containment protocols and shelter-in-place advisories. That meant someone in a government office was still pretending the perimeter would hold. We were 4 minutes from the veterinary clinic when we saw the first one. It was standing in the median of a 4-lane road, swaying slightly, wearing a fast food uniform with a name tag I couldn't read at speed. Its head tracked our truck as we passed. Not the head turn of a person watching traffic, the smooth, predatory rotation of something that had locked onto movement and was calculating whether to pursue. Nora's hand found my forearm and squeezed once. Neither of us said a word. Marcus was standing outside the clinic with a fire extinguisher in one hand and his truck keys in the other. The front window of the building was shattered. Glass littered the sidewalk in a pattern that meant something had come through from the inside. "One of the overnight boarders," he said before we'd fully stopped. His voice was flat in a way I'd never heard from him. Marcus was a man who narrated his own life at volume, jokes, complaints, observations about dogs delivered in a sportscaster's cadence. This was someone else. Golden Retriever. The owner dropped it off yesterday evening. Boarding for the week, she said. Dog was fine at intake. Passed the health screen. Normal temp, normal behavior. "Marcus," Nora said. "It changed around 4 a.m. I was doing rounds. Heard the kennel door rattling and thought it had gotten anxious. When I went back there..." He stopped, looked at the fire extinguisher in his hand as though he'd forgotten he was holding it. It wasn't a dog anymore. Not the way it moved, not the sound it made. I looked at the shattered window. A smear of something dark ran along the lower edge of the frame. "Did it bite you?" Nora asked. And there was no softness in the question. It was clinical, necessary. "No, I got behind the supply room door. It went for the window." He pointed across the street toward a residential block. "Went that direction. Fast." "We're leaving the city," I said. "Right now. There's a place my grandfather marked it. We can explain on the road, but we need to go." Marcus looked at Nora. She nodded once. That was enough for him. He tossed the fire extinguisher into a recycling bin with a clang that echoed off the empty storefronts and climbed into the bed of my Tacoma without asking permission, folding his large frame against the camper shell wall and pulling the tailgate down behind him. We were back on the road in under 2 minutes. I followed the route my grandfather had marked, a series of county roads and state highways that avoided every major artery. At the time, it felt overly cautious. By noon, I'd understand it was the only reason we survived. The city thinned. Suburbs gave way to exurbs, then to agricultural land, then to the long wooded stretches where cell towers grow sparse and radio stations fade to static. Nora monitored the emergency broadcast while I drove. Marcus, through the rear window of the cab, sat with his back straight and his eyes fixed on the road behind us, watching for something I didn't want to name. The broadcast changed at 9:12 a.m. The measured language was gone. A different voice rower, less rehearsed, was reading a list of cities under mandatory evacuation orders. Raleigh, Durham, Greensboro, Charlotte. The list kept growing. Then the voice said something that made Nora reach for the volume. "Do not approach individuals displaying erratic motor behavior. Do not attempt to assist individuals who appear injured if their movements are..." A pause. Paper shuffling. "If their movements are non-volitional in nature, maintain distance, barricade interior spaces, await further instruction." "Non-volitional," Marcus said from the truck bed, his voice muffled but audible. "They can't even say it." He was right. The word they couldn't say was the word none of us had said either, because saying it would make it real. Saying it would mean this was the thing we'd seen in films, and joked about at parties, and dismissed as impossible. And now it was behind us, spreading through a city we'd left 47 minutes ago. And the distance between us and it was measured not in miles, but in hours. I pressed the accelerator down and watched the speedometer climb past 70. Nora unfolded the map across her knees and began counting the miles to the red circle. My grandfather's route took us off the state highway just past a town called Bramwell, population 900, if the faded sign was honest. The Coleman Road wasn't marked on any modern map I'd ever seen. It appeared on his USGS sheet as a thin dashed line threading between two ridges, and in reality, it was a single-lane gravel track that hadn't been graded in years. Grass grew in the center strip. Branches scraped the Tacoma's sides like fingernails on a chalkboard. We'd been driving for 4 hours. The radio had gone to static 20 minutes earlier. Nora's phone showed no signal. Marcus had moved from the truck bed to the back seat of the cab when we'd stopped to refuel from the 2 jerry cans I kept strapped to the camper shell. He smelled like antiseptic and dog shampoo and fear. "How did your grandfather know?" he asked. Not challenging, genuine. I told them what I knew, which wasn't much. Harold Mercer had worked for FEMA from 1971 to 2003. Infrastructure assessment, he'd always said. Post-disaster evaluation. He'd traveled to flood zones, earthquake sites, hurricane corridors, and come back with stories about levees and load-bearing calculations. But there'd always been gaps, weeks where he was unreachable. Trips that didn't align with any disaster I could find in the news. My grandmother would say he was consulting, and change the subject with the practiced ease of a woman who'd made peace with not knowing. The letter suggested the truth was larger. Federal research installations, containment protocols. A man who'd spent decades evaluating what happened when systems failed, and who had apparently decided, at some point, to build a place designed to survive the failure he feared most. "So he's a prepper," Marcus said. "No." I shook my head, navigating around a fallen branch that half-blocked the road. "Preppers stockpile. My grandfather engineered. There's a difference." Nora was quiet. She'd been quiet for the last hour, which was unusual. Nora processed anxiety through conversation. Silence meant she was working through something she wasn't ready to share. The Coleman Road climbed. The Tacoma's engine strained against the grade, gravel popping under the tires with a sound like distant small arms fire. The forest closed in oak, hickory, tulip poplar, the dense mixed hardwood of the southern Appalachian slopes. The canopy was so thick that the midday sun reached us only in scattered coins of light. At mile marker 7, I was counting on the odometer. We came around a switchback and found the road blocked. Not by debris, by a truck. A full-size Chevy Silverado, parked sideways across the road with its driver's door open and its engine off. The windshield was intact. The keys were still in the ignition. I could see them catching light from where I stopped, 30 yards back. "Stay here," I said. "No," Nora and Marcus said simultaneously. We approached together. Marcus carried a tire iron. Nora had a fixed-blade knife from her go-bag. I had my grandfather's hunting knife and a flashlight, though I wasn't sure what the flashlight would do that the knife wouldn't. The Silverado was empty. No blood, no signs of struggle. But the seat was pushed all the way back, as if the driver had been tall. And on the passenger seat was an open first aid kit with several gauze packets torn open and discarded. Used, stained. Marcus checked the truck bed. 2 duffel bags, a case of water, a shotgun in a soft case. Whoever had been driving was equipped, had been injured, and had left on foot. Voluntarily, Nora asked, reading my thoughts. I looked at the tree line. The forest floor was a carpet of last year's leaves, and in the soft earth at the road's edge, I could see boot prints one set, deep and uneven, heading uphill into the woods. The left prints were dragging, the right prints were compensating, someone limping, someone bitten. They knew, I said. Nora understood first. A person bitten, driving as far as they could, stopping when the fever began, leaving the truck, the supplies, the weapon, walking into the woods to be alone when it happened. A final act of decency from someone who understood what they were becoming. We moved the Silverado enough to pass. Marcus took the shotgun and the case of water. I wanted to take the duffel bags, but something about it felt like grave robbing. And we had enough for now. We drove on. The boot prints in my mind wouldn't leave. Someone had made that walk, knowing it was the last walk they'd make as themselves. I thought about my grandfather, his letter, the steadiness of those 2 paragraphs. Had he known someone like the driver of that Silverado? Had he seen the early cases? Was that why his hand shook on the envelope but not on the page? Because the envelope was emotion, and the letter was duty. The road narrowed further. The grade steepened. And then, at mile marker 11, the trees opened. The hollow my grandfather had circled sat at the confluence of 2 ridge lines, sheltered on 3 sides by steep terrain and open on the 4th to a narrow valley that dropped toward a creek. The creek was the blue thread I'd seen on the map in person. It was a fast-moving mountain stream about 8 feet across, running clear over a bed of mossy rock. The structure wasn't visible from the road. That was intentional. You had to take a fork unmarked, barely wider than a footpath, and follow it 200 yards through dense rhododendron before the trees gave way to a clearing. And there it was. I don't know what I expected. A bunker, maybe, a cabin. Something that looked like fear made physical. What my grandfather had built was none of those things. It was a compound, though that word implies something militant, and this wasn't that. 2 structures, a main building, single story, built into the hillside with a sod roof that blended into the slope, and a smaller outbuilding that I'd later discover housed a workshop, a root cellar, and a gravity-fed water system drawing from a spring uphill. The main building was constructed from locally sourced stone and heavy timber, with narrow windows set high on the walls, too high and too narrow for anything to climb through easily, but wide enough to admit light and allow observation. A covered porch ran the length of the south-facing wall, and beneath it, a heavy steel door was set into a reinforced frame. The door was locked. The key was where grandfather's letter said it would be inside a false stone in the foundation wall, 3rd from the left of the porch steps. The stone pulled out to reveal a waterproof box containing 2 keys, a sealed envelope, and a laminated card with a hand-drawn schematic of the building's systems. Inside, the air was cool and still, the way underground air always is. The walls were stone on the exterior and insulated timber on the interior. The floor was polished concrete with radiant heating channels, though I wouldn't figure out the wood-fired boiler system for another day. The main room was open plan, a kitchen area with a propane stove and hand pump connected to the spring system, a living area with a wood stove, and a long table that could seat 8. Off the main room, a hallway led to 3 sleeping quarters, each with a built-in bunk and storage. A 4th door opened to a bathroom with a composting toilet and a gravity shower. It was sparse. It was functional. It was, I realized, as I stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, the product of decades of quiet, meticulous preparation by a man who had spent his career understanding exactly how civilization comes apart. The sealed envelope on the table, the one from the false stone, contained a second letter. This one was calmer. Instructions. How to operate the water system. How to manage the propane supply, which he estimated would last 18 months with conservative use. Where the cached supplies were buried 3 separate locations within 200 yards, each marked with a specific arrangement of stones that looked natural unless you knew the pattern. How to maintain the perimeter. How to collapse the access road if necessary, using 2 pre-placed charges that I was not to touch until I had read the blasting manual in the workshop. The last paragraph stopped me. There may be others who come. Use your judgment, but remember, survival without community is just a slower death. I built this for a family, Elliot. Fill it. Marcus was already unloading the truck. Nora was testing the water pump, which coughed once and then delivered a stream so cold it made her gasp. Diesel the cat had been released from his carrier and was investigating the perimeter of the main room with the cautious authority of a building inspector. I stood on the porch and looked down the hollow toward the narrow valley, the creek, the wall of forest beyond. Somewhere behind those ridges, the world was ending. Here, my grandfather had carved out a pocket of time. I didn't know yet how little time it would be. The first night, none of us slept. Not because of fear, though it was there, a low hum beneath every thought, but because there was too much to understand. The compound systems were more complex than I'd anticipated. Marcus and I spent 3 hours tracing the water lines from the spring to the holding tank to the kitchen pump, identifying 2 valves that needed replacing and a section of pipe where condensation had caused surface corrosion. Nora cataloged the cached supplies from the first 2 burial sites. Canned food, medical supplies, water purification tablets, ammunition for a rifle we found locked in the workshop. A bolt-action .308 with a scope and 200 rounds. Your grandfather wasn't playing around, Marcus said, turning a sealed mylar bag of freeze-dried meals over in his hands. He wasn't. The more I uncovered, the more I understood the scale of what Harold Mercer had done. This wasn't a weekend project or a retirement hobby. This was a life's secondary purpose, built in parallel to the life I'd known: the fishing trips, the Thanksgiving dinners, the quiet man in the armchair who smelled like pipe tobacco and always asked about my work with genuine interest. All of that was real. But so was this. The radio picked up a signal around midnight. Faint, warped by the terrain, but intelligible in fragments. A station out of Knoxville was broadcasting. What we caught came in pieces. Military withdrawal from urban centers, and infection rate exceeding containment projections by... And then, horribly, civilian population is advised that federal assistance cannot be guaranteed beyond... The signal died. Nora turned the crank for 10 minutes trying to get it back. When she finally stopped, her hands were trembling, and she set the radio down with the precise, deliberate care of someone managing a detonator. "What does beyond mean?" Marcus asked. "It means they're gone," Nora said. "It means whatever line they were holding, they're not holding it anymore." We sat with that. The wood stove clicked as the metal cooled. Diesel slept on a folded blanket in the corner, with his paws tucked beneath him, unbothered by extinction. Outside, the forest made the sounds forests make: a wind, branch creak, the distant percussion of the creek. No moans, no shuffling, no sound of what was coming. I opened the second envelope, the one I'd been avoiding. My grandfather's handwriting again, but different. This wasn't instruction. This was confession. He wrote about a facility in eastern North Carolina that he'd been brought in to assess in 1997. a biocontainment lab operating under a FEMA continuity of government contract. He wrote about what he'd seen in the sub-levels: test subjects, restraints, researchers who spoke about their work with the brittle enthusiasm of people who had crossed a line and couldn't afford to look back. He wrote about filing a report that was received, acknowledged, and buried. He wrote about 26 years of knowing that somewhere in a concrete building behind a chain-link fence, people were developing something that could end the species, and that the only response available to him was to build a place where his family might survive when it did. "I am not a brave man," he wrote. "A brave man would have gone public. A brave man would have risked his career, his pension, his family's stability. I chose to protect my own. I don't know if that's forgivable. I built you a refuge instead of building the world a warning. I hope you never have to use it. I know you will." I folded the letter. Nora was watching me. "He knew," I said. "For almost 30 years he knew." She didn't ask me how I felt about that. She could see at the collision of grief and gratitude and anger and love that doesn't resolve into anything clean. My grandfather had kept a secret that might have saved millions, and instead he'd saved me. I didn't know how to hold both of those truths at once. I still don't. They came on the third day, not infected people. A woman and a teenage boy emerging from the tree line on the south side of the hollow like deer stepping into a clearing, cautious and ready to bolt. I saw them from the porch where I'd been repairing a shutter hinge. The woman had a backpack and a hatchet. The boy had nothing. They were dirty, exhausted, and the woman was limping on her right ankle in a way that suggested a sprain rather than a bite. This is a distinction I was already learning to make at distance. And the fact that I'd developed that reflex in 72 hours told me something about what I was becoming. Marcus came out behind me with the shotgun. Not raised, present. "We're not looking for trouble," the woman said. She had a voice that carried clear, unafraid, with the cadence of someone accustomed to being heard. Late 40s, dark hair pulled back tight, eyes that assessed everything in a single sweep. "We saw smoke from your chimney yesterday. Took us a day to find the road." "Where did you come from?" I asked. "Bramwell. What's left of it." The boy, her son, I assumed, and I was wrong, stood slightly behind her, with his arms wrapped around himself. 14, maybe 15. Thin, watchful. He hadn't spoken. "How bad is Bramwell?" Nora asked from the doorway. The woman's jaw tightened. "It's not a town anymore." Her name was Dana Reeves. She'd been a county emergency manager, the kind of local official who coordinates flood responses and writes grants for storm shelters. She'd been the one to receive the first federal advisory, 20 hours before the public broadcast. She'd mobilized what she could: opened the community center, organized supply distribution, established a perimeter with the 6 volunteer firefighters who showed up. For 12 hours, it worked. Then a family arrived from the east, a husband and wife and their 3 children. And the husband was sweating and couldn't explain why. And by the time Dana recognized the signs, the husband had turned in the community center's main hall with 40 people inside. She told this without embellishment. Facts, sequence, outcome. But her hands shook the way my grandfather's handwriting had shaken: precision, fighting terror. The boy's name was Kieran. He wasn't her son. He was the surviving child of the family from the east. Dana had pulled him out of the community center through a fire exit, while his turned father, tore through the people who'd come there for safety. His mother and 2 sisters hadn't made it out of the building. Kieran didn't speak for the first 2 days. He sat in the corner of the main room near Diesel, who seemed to understand something about the boy's stillness, and curled against his leg with a rumbling purr, That was the only sound Kieran seemed to tolerate. I thought about my grandfather's letter. Survival without community is just a slower death. I built this for a family. Fill it. Dana earned her place within hours. She understood systems water, food distribution, waste management, security rotations. She reorganized our supply catalog, identified a caloric shortfall that would hit us in 6 weeks without supplementation, and proposed a foraging schedule based on the edible plants she'd identified within a quarter-mile of the compound. Marcus deferred to her on logistics with visible relief. He was a man built for tasks, not planning. And Dana was a woman who could see 6 moves ahead. Nora watched Dana with an expression I recognized the careful evaluation of a person deciding whether to trust. Nora's trust was a drawbridge. Once lowered, it held enormous weight, but it didn't lower easily. "She's competent," Nora said to me that evening, while we checked the perimeter tripwires Marcus had rigged along the access path. 300 yards of fishing line connected to tin cans filled with gravel, primitive. But the sound would carry in the hollow's acoustics. "But," I said, "she left 40 people in that community center. She saved the boy. One boy." Nora's voice wasn't cruel. It was precise. "She made a calculation, Elliot. I'm not saying it was wrong. I'm saying she can make calculations. That's useful. It's also something to watch." I didn't argue. Nora saw people the way she saw animal patients, with compassion, but without the luxury of sentimentality. An animal will bite you while you're saving its life. People will do worse. Kieran spoke on the 5th day, not to me or Nora or Marcus or Dana, to Diesel. I overheard him from the hallway, his voice barely above a whisper, telling the cat about a video game he'd been playing before everything happened. Something about building a world block by block. He described it in detail, the structures he'd made, the landscapes he'd designed, the hours he'd spent creating a place that existed only inside a screen. His voice was steady and small and ancient, in a way that 15-year-old voices shouldn't be. When he finished, Diesel headbutted his chin, and Kieran laughed. One short, startled sound, like a cough. Then he cried. I stepped back from the hallway and let him have it. Some things aren't meant to be witnessed. They're just meant to happen. That afternoon, I found the 3rd cache. My grandfather's stone marker system led me to a spot 200 yards northeast of the compound, near a rock outcropping where the creek bent sharply. Beneath 18 inches of earth and a waterproof tarp, I found a sealed plastic drum containing something I hadn't expected. Documents. Not survival manuals or technical guides, though there were those too, but a thick folder of photocopied reports, inter-office memos, and hand-annotated maps, all relating to the facility in eastern North Carolina. I brought them back and spread them on the long table after dinner. Dana leaned forward. Her eyes moved across the documents with the speed of someone who'd spent a career reading government paperwork. "This is a continuity of operations plan," she said, tapping a page. COG. I've seen the civilian versions, their templates for maintaining government function during catastrophic events. But this one. She turned a page. Her finger stopped on a paragraph marked with my grandfather's red ink. This references a population reduction threshold. They modeled it. They knew what the infection rate would look like if containment failed, and they planned for post-collapse governance. "They planned for after," Marcus said. "They planned for after," Dana confirmed. "Which means they built infrastructure for after. Somewhere." The documents referenced locations by code cardinal, ridgeline, vault. No coordinates, no state names. But cross-referenced with the USGS map and my grandfather's annotations, a picture began to emerge. Cardinal was the research facility. Ridgeline appeared to be a military installation in the mountains, possibly the same mountain range we were sitting in. Vault was something else. Something my grandfather had circled and written beside in his smallest, most careful handwriting. If they reach Vault, it's over. Not because of what's inside, because of who. I didn't know what that meant. I wasn't sure I wanted to. What I did know was that we were not alone in these mountains. The documents confirmed the existence of at least 3 other prepared sites within a 50-mile radius, built under the same program my grandfather had accessed. Whether those sites were occupied, whether the people in them were friendly, whether the infrastructure had survived, all unknown. Nora found me on the porch that night, staring at the dark line of the ridgeline against a sky so dense with stars it looked artificial. No light pollution anymore. No cities glowing on the horizon. Just the ancient dark, the kind humans hadn't seen in generations. "You're wondering if we should make contact," she said. "I'm wondering if we have a choice. Dana's caloric math doesn't lie. We have supplies for 5 people for maybe 10 weeks. After that, we're foraging, hunting, or starving. Or trading. With who? We don't know who's out there. Which is exactly why we need to find out." She sat beside me on the porch step, close enough that our shoulders touched. "Your grandfather built this place for survival, Elliot. But survival isn't static. Eventually, we have to go out there." She was right. She was usually right. That was one of the reasons we'd broken up, not because she was wrong, but because being with someone who sees clearly is exhausting when you'd rather look away. "Not yet," I said. "Not yet," she agreed. "But soon." Soon came faster than either of us planned. On the 7th morning, Marcus came back from the creek at a dead run. "2 of them," he gasped, hands on his knees in the doorway. "At the water, downstream side." We'd developed a protocol. Dana took Kieran to the interior room, the one with no exterior windows and a door that could be barred from inside. Nora retrieved the .308 and posted at the high window on the east wall, which gave a line of sight down the hollow toward the creek. Marcus and I went to the porch with the shotgun and binoculars. Through the lenses, I could see them. 2 figures, standing in the creek where it pooled behind a natural stone dam. The water reached their knees. They weren't drinking. They weren't moving upstream or downstream. They were standing, swaying with the current, facing the same direction, our direction, with the slack, tilted posture of bodies whose operating system had been overwritten. One had been a man, tall, wearing the remnants of a hunter's vest, one arm hanging at an angle that meant the shoulder was dislocated or worse. The other was smaller, gender indistinguishable at this distance, wearing a dark jacket and no shoes. Their feet in the cold mountain water, their faces pointed at us like satellite dishes searching for signal. "Can they see us?" Marcus whispered. "I don't think it's sight," I said. I was remembering the figure in the median back in the city, the head tracking our truck. Not eyes following movement, something else. Something that operated on a frequency I couldn't name. We watched for 40 minutes. They didn't advance. They didn't leave. They stood in the water like monuments to the end of what they'd been. And the current moved around them. And the creek made its sound. And the birds, which had been singing all morning, went silent. Then, as though responding to a signal neither of us could perceive, they turned. Not toward us, downstream. And they walked, into the current, through the deepening water, around the bend in the creek, and out of sight. I realized my hands were cramping. I'd been gripping the porch railing so hard that the wood grain had imprinted into my palms. "They're ranging," Dana said when we told her. She'd come out of the safe room and was standing at the table with the topographic map spread in front of her. "They're not hunting, not actively. They're dispersing. The urban concentrations are played out. Food supply is exhausted." She said food supply without flinching, and I saw Nora register it. "So they spread, follow terrain, watercourses, valleys, paths of least resistance. The same patterns as any invasive population after resource depletion in its origin zone." "You're talking about them like they're wildlife," Marcus said. "I'm talking about them like they're a problem we need to predict." Dana's voice was even. "Emotion won't keep us alive. Understanding their behavior might." She was right. And Nora was right about Dana. She could make calculations. But standing on that porch, watching the space where two dead-eyed figures had stood in a mountain creek swaying like reeds, I understood that calculation alone wasn't enough. Something in me needed to remember that those things in the water had been people. That the one in the hunter's vest had probably walked these mountains for pleasure once. That the barefoot one had a name. The moment you stop remembering that, you start becoming something else. Something that survives, maybe, but something less. On the 12th day, a man walked up the access road in broad daylight, hands raised, shouting that he was alive. His name was Glenn Archer. Mid-50s, wiry, with a beard that had been neatly trimmed 2 weeks ago and was now beyond management. He wore a canvas jacket, work boots, and carried a pack that clinked when he set it down glass bottles, I'd later learn. Moonshine. Glenn was a distiller by hobby and an electrician by trade, and he'd been living in a hunting cabin 3 ridges east when the world ended. He'd found our smoke, same as Donna. "I'm not bit, I'm not sick, and I can wire anything that takes current," he said from 20 yards out, hands still raised, eyes moving between the shotgun Marcus held and the rifle barrel visible in the east window. "I also have 12 jars of corn whiskey and a working knowledge of small engine repair. You'd be stupid to turn me away." We didn't turn him away. My grandfather's letter echoed in my head. Fill it, and Glenn was useful. Within 2 days, he'd repaired the compound's solar trickle charger, rigged a battery bank from components he'd carried in his pack, and restored power to 3 LED light strips that made the main room feel less like a cave and more like a place people lived. But Glenn brought something else. News. He'd been monitoring a shortwave radio at his cabin and had caught transmissions from a group operating out of a decommissioned fire station roughly 30 miles northwest. They called themselves the Ridgeline Collective. 8 people, maybe more, organized and broadcasting on a regular schedule. They had food, medical supplies, and something Glenn described with a gravity that silenced the room. They say they have a doctor, an actual doctor, immunologist or something. She's been studying the infected, says the pathogen isn't random, it's engineered, and it has a shelf life. The viral load in the turned degrades over time. She thinks, and this is the part that matters, she thinks the infected will burn out. Months, maybe a year. The pathogen consumes the host, and eventually there's nothing left to keep it running. Silence. Then everyone spoke at once. "How does she know?" Dana asked. "What does burnout mean practically?" Nora asked. "Does that mean we just have to wait?" Marcus asked. "It means," Glenn said, pouring himself a measure of moonshine with the steady hand of a man who'd been self-medicating for days, "that there might be an after. And the question is whether we're in a position to reach it." That night, The compound hummed with something it hadn't held before. Hope. Dangerous, fragile, destabilizing hope. I watched it move through the group like a current. Marcus laughed for the first time in days. Kieran asked a question at dinner, his first voluntary words to anyone, besides the cat. Dana spread the map on the table and began calculating travel routes to the Ridgeline Collective with the focused energy of a woman who'd found a problem she could solve. Only Nora seemed unmoved. She sat apart, cleaning the .308 with methodical strokes, her face composed in the expression I knew meant she was running scenarios. "You don't believe it," I said quietly, sitting beside her. "I believe Glenn heard what he heard. I believe there's a group 30 miles northwest. I believe they have a person who claims to be a doctor." She slid the bolt back into the rifle with a precise click. "What I don't believe is that anything in this situation is as simple as waiting. If the infected burn out, then the people who survive are the ones with resources. And when desperate people learn that survival is a matter of holding out, they stop cooperating and start hoarding. Hope doesn't make people generous, Elliot. It makes them territorial. The infected aren't our only threat. They never were." I wanted to argue. I wanted to hold on to the warmth I'd felt when Glenn spoke. The possibility that this had an expiration date, that the world was on pause rather than ended. But Nora's logic was a blade, and it cut through every comfort I tried to build. She was right. She was always right. And the proof arrived 3 days later. The shot came from the South Ridge at dawn. A single crack that echoed through the hollow and sent birds erupting from the canopy in a black wave. Marcus, who'd been on the porch for the early watch, dropped flat. The round hit the stone wall 2 feet above his head and sent chips spraying into his hair. Someone was shooting at us. We went to protocol Kieran and Diesel to the interior room, Dana barring the door behind them. Nora took the east window with the .308. Glenn produced a handgun. I hadn't known he was carrying a compact 9mm he'd kept in his waistband beneath his jacket, and positioned himself at the west window. Marcus and I stayed low on the porch, trying to locate the shooter. A second shot. This one hit the Tacoma's tailgate with a metallic punch that made me flinch. Not aimed at us, I realized. Aimed at our vehicle. "They're not trying to kill us," I said. "They're trying to pin us down." "Same result if we stick our heads up," Marcus said. 20 minutes passed. No more shots. Then a voice from the tree line, amplified, maybe through a bullhorn, maybe just a voice that carried. "We know you've got supplies. We've been watching the smoke for a week. Send out half of what you've got and we walk away. Nobody gets hurt. You've got 20 minutes. Dana's prediction, made in the abstract over a map and a cup of instant coffee, had materialized in the specific. People with guns, doing the math of survival, deciding that our supplies were worth more than our lives. "How many?" Nora asked from the window, her eye never leaving the scope. "I see 2 positions on the ridge," Glenn said from the west side. "But that doesn't mean there aren't more." "We can't give them half," Dana said from behind the interior door, her voice muffled but commanding. "Half our supplies cuts our timeline to 5 weeks. In 5 weeks, we're foraging full time, which means exposure, which means risk multiplies. It's not a negotiation. It's a death sentence on a delay." "If we don't give them something, they'll rush us," Marcus said. "Let them," Nora said. Her voice was ice on glass. "We have fortified position, elevation advantage on 3 sides, and they're spread thin on an exposed ridge. If they rush, they lose." "People will die, Nora," I said. She looked at me then, pulled her eye from the scope, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her, not anger, Not cruelty, but a settled certainty that was more frightening than either. People are already dead, Elliot. The question is whether we join them. The 20 minutes passed. I spent them in a state of compressed terror, crouched behind the porch wall with my grandfather's hunting knife in my hand, and the absurd understanding that a knife was meaningless against a rifle. Then Glenn did something I didn't expect. He stood up, fully, walked to the edge of the porch, raised both hands. "You on the ridge," he called out. "I know you can hear me. I'm Glenn Archer. I ran electrical for half the county before all this. You want to shoot a man who can keep the lights on? Think about that." Silence from the ridge. Then, distantly, the sound of voices conferring. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable disagreement. Fracture. "I'm going to walk toward you," Glenn continued, unarmed. "We can talk. If talking doesn't work, you can go back to shooting, and my friends here will put you down. But let's try talking first." He walked. I watched him cross the clearing with measured strides, hands visible, moving toward the tree line like a man approaching a nervous animal. He disappeared into the forest. Nora kept her scope trained on the ridge. Marcus gripped the shotgun until his knuckles went white. 40 minutes later, Glenn came back. Behind him, at a cautious distance, came two people, a man and a woman. Both gaunt, both armed, both looking at the compound with the naked hunger of people who'd been sleeping in the open for too long. "They're coming in," Glenn said from the clearing. "And before anyone argues, hear what they have to say." Their names were Carl and Tammy Birch. Married, mid-40s. They'd owned a small farm outside Bramwell, the same Bramwell Dana and Kieran had fled. They'd held their property for 9 days, barricading the farmhouse, rationing their pantry, losing their 2 farmhands to an infected that came through the barn on the 4th night. By day 9, the food was gone, and the infected were clustering along the road in numbers that made leaving by vehicle impossible. They'd walked out through the back pasture at 3 in the morning, carrying what they could, following the creek upstream into the mountains. For 6 days, they'd survived on creek water, wild onions, and the dwindling contents of a single backpack. They'd found our smoke. They'd watched us for 2 days, trying to decide whether to ask or take. "We chose wrong," Tammy said. She was sitting at the long table with a cup of hot water in both hands, and her voice had the raw quality of someone who hadn't used it much recently. Carl wanted to just walk up, ask. I said no one was going to share willingly. I was the one who said to threaten first. She looked at her husband, then at us. I was wrong. Carl said nothing. He sat beside her with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on a fixed middle distance, and I recognized the look. It was the look of a man who'd been talked into something against his instincts and now had to live inside the result. The room divided. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the fault lines appeared with the precision of a geological map. Dana wanted them gone, not cruelly, practically. 2 more mouths accelerate every timeline. Every calorie calculation I've made assumes 5 people. 7 changes the math fundamentally. Marcus wanted to let them stay. They're people. They're standing in front of us, hungry, and we've got food. I don't need a spreadsheet to know what to do. Glenn was neutral, which I was learning was his default. A man who observed and brokered, but rarely committed until the outcome was clear. Nora said nothing. She cleaned the .308 and watched. Kieran, from the doorway of the interior room, said, "They can have my share. I don't eat much anyway." That sentence from a 15-year-old boy who'd watched his family die and hadn't spoken voluntarily for 5 days, landed in the room like a stone in still water. Nobody responded for a long moment. "We're not cutting anyone's share," I said. "We find more food. We hunt. We forage. We make contact with the Ridgeline Collective, and we trade Glenn's skills and Dana's organizational experience for supplies we can't generate on our own. My grandfather built this place for a family. He didn't define how large." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't calculated. It was the only thing I could say that felt true. But I saw the effect, saw Dana's resistance soften by a degree, saw Marcus straighten with conviction, saw Carl Birch look at me for the first time with something other than shame. Tammy Birch cried. Not theatrically, just tears running down weathered cheeks into the cup of hot water she hadn't yet drunk. Tammy, I would learn, had been the one to shoot at us. Carl didn't know how to fire a rifle. The weapon was hers, a deer rifle she'd taken from their farmhouse. She'd aimed high deliberately. The shot that nearly hit Marcus was poor aim, not intent. "I'm sorry," she said to Marcus directly. Marcus, who had chips of stone still in his hair, who could have died from a headshot delivered by a desperate woman on a ridge, looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You missed. We'll call it even." It wasn't forgiveness. It was something stranger and more functional. The recognition that in this new world, the math of grudges was a luxury no one could afford. That night, we were 7. The compound felt different with 7. Fuller, louder. The propane stove ran longer for dinner. The sleeping quarters were reorganized, Carl and Tammy in the 3rd room, Glenn on a cot in the workshop he'd claimed as his domain. The outhouse schedule required coordination. The water system strained under the increased load. But there was something else, too. Something that had been missing since the first day. Conversation. Carl told stories about farming that made Marcus laugh. Tammy showed Nora a technique for drying wild herbs that Nora's veterinary knowledge recognized as practical. Kieran sat closer to the group. Diesel moved between laps like a diplomat conducting shuttle negotiations. My grandfather had known. Survival alone was possible. Survival together was something else, harder, riskier, more volatile. But it was the only kind worth building a place for. On the 18th day, we made contact with the Ridgeline Collective. Glenn rebuilt the shortwave receiver using components from his battery bank. And at 9 p.m. on a clear Tuesday, I was still counting days, still marking them on a wall with a pencil, because letting go of the calendar felt like letting go of something human. A voice came through the static. Her name was Dr. Lena Osei. She spoke with the measured cadence of an academic and the undertone of someone running on 4 hours of sleep and sheer obligation. She confirmed what Glenn had reported. She was an immunologist, formerly with the CDC, and she'd been studying tissue samples from terminated infected. The pathogen was engineered a modified rabies variant spliced with a hemorrhagic component that accelerated neurological takeover. It was brilliant, she said, and the word sounded like a curse in her mouth. Brilliant and flawed. The virus is metabolically expensive, she explained over the crackling connection. It burns through the host's caloric reserves at an extraordinary rate. Without external caloric intake, without feeding the infected body, degrades within 8 to 12 months. Muscular atrophy, organ failure, eventual total cessation. They're burning themselves alive from the inside. So we wait, Dana said. You survive, Dr. Osei corrected. Waiting implies passivity. The next 8 months will be the most dangerous. Infected are at peak mobility, peak aggression. They're dispersing from depleted urban centers into exactly the kind of terrain you're describing. Your hollow is not as hidden as you think. They follow water. They follow sound. They will find you, eventually. Silence in the room. The warmth of hope, which had been building for days, didn't extinguish. But it cooled. It became something harder, more durable, less comfortable. Dr. Osei proposed a plan. The Ridgeline Collective had medical supplies, technical knowledge, and a defensible position in the old fire station. What they lacked was food production capacity and skilled labor. We had arable land near the creek, Dana's organizational experience, Glenn's electrical expertise, Carl and Tammy's agricultural knowledge. A partnership, not merger partnership. Regular supply exchanges along a route that could be cleared and maintained between the two locations. The road between us is 30 miles through infected active terrain, she said. It's not a casual trip. But if we don't establish a supply line, both groups fail independently. The infected don't need to kill us. Isolation will. The vote was unanimous. Even Nora, who I'd expected to dissent, agreed, though her agreement came with conditions. Armed escort, predetermined checkpoints, abort protocols if infected density exceeded a threshold she defined with clinical specificity. The first supply run was set for 3 days later. 3 volunteers. The route would follow a ridgeline trail that avoided the valley floor higher ground, better visibility, harder walking. Glenn mapped it using the topographic sheets and his knowledge of the local terrain. Dana calculated the supply load, what we could spare, what we needed in return. Marcus volunteered immediately. I volunteered second. The third was Tammy. I'm a better shot than anyone here except Nora, she said. And Nora needs to stay with the compound. I owe you this. Nobody argued. Tammy's marksmanship had nearly killed Marcus. Now it might keep him alive. The symmetry was ugly and perfect. The morning we left, Kieran was standing on the porch. He'd been talking more, not freely, not like a normal teenager, but in measured sentences that carried weight beyond his years. He'd taken to helping Marcus with physical tasks, carrying wood, clearing brush, work that put his thin body in motion and kept his mind out of the dark rooms it wanted to visit. Come back, he said. Not a request, an instruction, as though by saying it with enough authority, he could make it true. Plan to, Marcus said, and ruffled the boy's hair. Kieran tolerated it the way cats tolerate affection with visible endurance and invisible need. Nora walked me to the edge of the clearing. She didn't say, be careful. She didn't say, come back. She handed me 3 extra rounds for the handgun Glenn had lent me and said, if you have to use these, don't hesitate. Hesitation kills faster than bullets. Then she kissed my forehead. Quick, firm. The kind of gesture that isn't romance, it's a seal. A stamp on an envelope you're not sure will arrive. The ridge trail was harder than the map suggested. 30 miles over uneven terrain at elevation, with loaded packs, moving quietly, stopping every quarter mile to listen and glass the surrounding forest with binoculars. Marcus set the pace long, ground-eating strides that Tammy and I struggled to match but didn't complain about, because speed was safety and the forest was not empty. We saw them 3 times. The first was a lone figure on a hillside, a half-mile east, moving down slope with the mechanical persistence that defined them. No pause, no variation, no response to terrain beyond the minimum necessary to stay upright. It didn't detect us. We crouched behind a rock outcropping and watched it disappear into a drainage. The second was worse. A group, 7, maybe 8, clustered around something on the forest floor that I couldn't identify and didn't want to. They were making sounds, not the moans of horror films, but a rapid, wet clicking that seemed to come from their throats rather than their mouths. A communication? A feeding behavior? I didn't know. Tammy raised her rifle. I put my hand on the barrel and shook my head. 7 rounds wouldn't stop 8. Not at this distance, not moving, not without drawing every infected in earshot. We detoured. 2 extra miles, 2 extra hours. The third encounter was the one that changed something in me. We were descending a saddle between 2 peaks, 4 miles from the Ridgeline Collective's coordinates, when we heard a voice. Human, calling for help. It came from below the trail, down a steep embankment, in a thicket of mountain laurel, so dense it was nearly impenetrable. A man's voice, broken and hoarse, saying please over and over. Marcus stopped. Tammy stopped. I stopped. No, Tammy said immediately. We don't know, Marcus started. I know, Tammy said. Listen to the rhythm. That's not a person making a decision to call for help. That's a loop. It's repeating. I listened. She was right. The please came at identical intervals, every 4 seconds. Same pitch, same cadence, same break in the voice at the same syllable. Not a person calling out. A recording, or worse, a pattern. A fragment of the host's last conscious vocalization, replaying on a neurological loop like a skipping record. We moved on. The voice followed us for a 1/4 mile, growing fainter, never changing. I thought about the person it had been. The last thing they'd said before the pathogen took their cortex. Please. Directed at someone. A loved one. A stranger. God. Whoever had been close enough to hear when the fever broke their mind. I carry that sound. I'll carry it until I don't carry anything anymore. The Ridgeline Collective's fire station appeared through the trees in late afternoon. Concrete block, 2 stories. A vehicle bay that had been reinforced with steel sheeting. On the roof, a figure with binoculars tracked our approach. 3 coming in, Marcus shouted, hands raised. Glenn Archer sent us. The door opened. Dr. Lena Osei was shorter than her voice suggested, 5'2", compact, with close-cropped hair and glasses that sat crookedly on her nose. She looked at us the way a doctor looks at patients, assessing damage, estimating capability, calculating whether the resources spent on treatment would yield returns. You made it, she said. Not warmly, not coldly, factually. We made it, I said. She stepped aside. We walked in. The fire station smelled like antiseptic and wood smoke and the particular human density of too many bodies in too small a space. 8 people looked up from various tasks, cleaning weapons, sorting supplies, repairing equipment. 8 faces performing the same rapid evaluation we just received from Osei. Are you worth the food you'll consume? I thought of my grandfather's compound. The porch, the creek, the hollow sheltered on 3 sides. I thought of Nora at the high window, Kieran on the porch, Dana at the table with her maps and her calculations. I thought of the red circle on the map, and the man who'd drawn it, and the decades of secret labor that had brought us to this moment. We traded. Glenn's wiring diagrams for antibiotics, Dana's organizational templates for seed stock, Carl and Tammy's farming knowledge, transcribed in Tammy's neat handwriting, for a water purification system Osei's people had salvaged from a decommissioned National Guard post. The exchange was formal, careful, each side measuring what it gave against what it received. And I understood that this was how civilization rebuilds, not in grand gestures, but in small, suspicious transactions between people who need each other more than they trust each other. Dr. Osei walked me to the door when we left. "Your grandfather," she said. "Harold Mercer." I stopped. "You knew him?" "I knew his reports. He filed assessments on 3 facilities I worked adjacent to. He was the only infrastructure evaluator who consistently recommended shutdown. Every time, he was overruled." She adjusted her crooked glasses. "He was right every time." "I know," I said. "Do you know he was the one who leaked the initial pathogen profile to 6 independent researchers 4 days before containment breach? Anonymously. Gave us enough warning to begin preliminary analysis before the collapse cut our access." I didn't know. My grandfather, the quiet man in the armchair, the map maker, the builder of hidden places, leaking classified data at 81 years old. Not a brave man, he'd written. I disagreed. Bravery wasn't the absence of compromise. It was doing what you could within the space compromise left you. The walk back took 11 hours. We saw no infected. The forest was quiet in the way forests are quiet when something large has recently passed through. At dawn, we reached the Coleman Road. At the compound, Nora was on the porch with the rifle across her knees, and I knew she hadn't slept. "Done?" she asked. "Started," I said. 7 months later, I'm writing this at the long table. It's late. The wood stove is ticking. Diesel is asleep on Kieran's bed. Kieran, who is 16 now, who speaks in full sentences, who is learning to hunt with Tammy and to wire circuits with Glenn, and to read topographic maps with a fluency that would have made my grandfather proud. My grandfather. I called him once more that first week. The line connected, but no one answered. I choose to believe he was already gone by then, peacefully, on his own terms, beside my grandmother, with his arrangements made and his conscience as clear as a man in his position could make it. I have no evidence for this. I have no evidence against it. I have the map. I have the compound. I have the circle he drew in red ink, pressing so hard the paper nearly tore, because he wanted to make sure I couldn't miss it. The infected are thinning. Dr. Osei's projections are holding. The ones we see now move slower, their bodies visibly degraded, their clicking sounds weaker. They're burning out. The world they unmade is still unmade. But in the hollow between 2 ridgelines, 7 people and a cat are building something in the wreckage. I don't know what to call it. It isn't civilization. It isn't family, exactly. It's the thing that happens when people who have every reason to walk away from each other choose not to. My grandfather built this place for exactly this. I think he knew I wouldn't fill it alone. I think he knew the map was never really about the location. It was about what I'd become on the way to it.